I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Vincent Baycoat. Dr. Baycoat is Associate Professor of Theology and is Director of CACE, that is the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, a part of Wheaton College. He's been with us here a number of months ago on Inside Wheaton. Vince, it's great to have you back.
Great to be here.
And we're sitting here on a day that we've gotten our first serious snow of the year, and you walked in, I could tell how thrilled you were with that.
When I was a child, snow was very exciting. I am learning to reacquaint myself with that joy and excitement of fresh snow. But I'm just not ready.
There is
for this
something about
at this
age
point.
on this, isn't there?
I guess there is, and I would just rather wait for snow to happen in December, or maybe
it is
even
early for us.
maybe even February.
Yeah, maybe.
I'd be fine at that. We had 1 week of snow, and that's it.
At the end of the day, we have nothing to say about it, do we?
Indeed.
Well, I am anxious, Vince, to talk to you about something that has happened recently. As a part of CACE, you recently had a panel on the complexities of the death penalty.
Yes.
And I was able to watch a portion of that. I did not get to view all of it. But what a fascinating and what an important topic, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And at least while I've been director, that's not a topic that we've talked about.
The death penalty, and I like the way you set it up in you were the moderator of this panel, and the way you set it up essentially was to say no matter where you come down on this, if you're a convinced proponent or one who is adamantly against it, we do need to think about it from a Christian perspective.
Precisely. And what I was getting at with that is if Jesus tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the second of the greatest commandment. So all the commandments that have to do with how we operate toward other human beings, if there's some expression of love your neighbor as yourself, then that means our commitment to justice ought to be influenced by that. That it ought to be an expression of that. And what I've learned is that the administration of the death penalty is very complicated. There are a lot of cracks in the system, and it's not so much a question of the guilt or innocence of the person that I'm trying to bring attention to, as much as the question of, do you want this system to be a truly just system? And if you can see that there are sufficient injustices, whether injustices because of neglect or because of just bad choices or other reasons, that if you see those injustices, well, what should a Christian posture be toward that? I mean, it seems to me that it should be a posture where we start asking questions about how is this being done.
So your concern, see if I'm understanding you right, is not so much at the level of is the death penalty warranted? It's can it be administered with justice?
Exactly. Because whether people are for or against it, my question is, if you're hawkish about this, let's say, well, are you also hawkish that the way this is administered is done with absolute justice? Because if Christians are going to have integrity about the way that we think about human beings, if we really believe all humans are created in the image of God, well, that even means people that have been incarcerated. They haven't somehow forfeited the right to be in the image of God.
Non-human.
Exactly, because they've committed a crime or because they're accused of a crime. So do you want these people to be treated with the dignity of being a human being created in the image of God, or don't you? And if you do, then we need to pay attention to the numerous complexities that there are, and that I learned about basically going to this Constitution Project event last April.
Let me try a couple of takes on this on you and get your response. First of all, the take that essentially says these are people for whom we have no more justice. I've heard it phrased this way, so therefore we send them on to God. In other words, the death penalty is saying, humanly, we're out of options. God, you decide, and the way we do that is by relegating you to death.
Well, the tricky thing about that is how well do we know the circumstance of this person in terms of the crime of which they're accused and perhaps convicted? how well do we know the administration of that entire process? And are we so clear on the administration of that process that we can then just say, well, it's better for society and probably even for you to no longer be with us. So to me, it's I can understand why a person might say that, but there are a lot of things that there are being assumed before we get to that point. And to me, that's why there's a problem. There are all these things before we get to that point that are problematic. I mean, for example, it's interesting that this is disproportionately for poorer people and minorities.
Yeah.
We don't hear about a whole lot of people who are millionaires going to death row.
Yeah.
So I wonder why.
The other take is sort of the opposite, flip side of the
Sure.
coin. The people who say if you're going to be pro-life
Sure.
and be consistent about it, you ought to be anti-death penalty as well.
Right. I think the tricky thing about that, so I'll at the risk of talking out both sides of my mouth here, I'll just address this. The tricky thing about it, from my view, is when we are talking about being pro-life and having a consistent pro-life ethic. I mean that's I would say the contemporary Roman Catholic position for sure, and certainly a Mennonite position. I think there's the question of how do we think about the role of government and government's role in administering justice in a society, and justice proportionate to crimes. So if you have a mass murderer, and there's no question that it's a mass murderer, and you do have a fair trial, and it is a state with the death penalty, I mean, is it an anti-life ethic to execute that person? I'm not sure from the standpoint of talking about the question of the justice of or the expression of governmental justice, that's necessarily quote unquote not really pro-life. I do think, to now talk out the other side of my mouth, if we are talking about the weightiness of putting someone to death, are we taking everything into account that goes along with putting someone to death? One of the things that was interesting in the panel was the former warden who was there from Oregon State Penitentiary. He talked about that when he had to administer this, and there hadn't been an execution in years, he basically had to ramp up this whole thing himself. So he had to learn about how you do this, et cetera. So it was quite an education for him. At some point, it also occurred to him that it wasn't only him who was involved with a person being put to death, but there are other people who were actually in the process of putting this person to death. And those persons are also, in certain cases, I mean, the ones actually administering it and actually being present throughout that.
Right.
And to what extent are we thinking about the persons that do that? I think sometimes we have this idea, and I think it's an idea we can have at a remove, because most of us will never be in the place of having to execute someone.
Yeah.
We think that, well, they're just doing their job, or maybe because they're thinking about justice, they're thinking good riddance, and there's no kind of difficulties that could have for them. Well, I mean, I think we need to think really carefully about that.
And there's a sense in which I think, Vince, you would say for the Christian, as you say, even if we decide at the end of the day this is a just penalty, there ought to be a sense, I think, where it's done with sadness, don't you?
Absolutely.
I see sometimes these demonstrations outside of an execution chamber with signs being held that say "Fry" or
yes.
And I think how, even if you're an advocate of the death penalty, how could you come to it with that kind of cavalier attitude?
Well, and I think some people they think that this is what justice requires because of the atrocities that were committed. And of course, you may have a situation like when before Timothy McVeigh was executed, he didn't seem particularly apologetic with his last words. So some people would think, I wish you weren't getting lethal injection. I wish you had.
It's a vengeance.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is that question of vengeance that people are thinking about, but that does lead us to the opportunity to think about, well, how should a Christian think about the gravity of taking a life? especially when it's the gravity of taking a life through the administration of justice, through what the government has set up. That's, I think, a really difficult circumstance if we think about being there. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Green Mile, the Stephen King movie. The Green Mile is the name of the part of the penitentiary where the people who are on death row is where they are. They call it the Green Mile. So and they walk the Green Mile to the death chamber, which in the movie was electrocution. And you see the somber sort of respectfulness that there is, and even I think the lament about people dying, and I think we need to have that in mind. But we are, at least in our society, we're removed from it, but also I think because of what we're able to do with media technologies, whether it's film or whether it's video games, we're able to have artificial representations of death, which, whether it's in a film or whether it's in a video game, let's say, and there can be so much of it that we just don't think about. There is, and we don't think about. Well, okay, when a person dies, you're talking about someone's child. We don't know what happened. We don't know why they got here. I mean, it's a tragedy in any case.
Yeah.
And with that tragedy, are we really sensing the gravity? Okay, a person is at the end here.
Yeah. Vince, where is, and I know this got talked about a little in the panel, where is the United States in relation to the broader world culture on this? I think this might surprise some people. I mean, aren't we sort of in the minority anymore among
well, I think among
developed
countries.
Yeah.
I mean, if you compare us to Western Europe, let's say, certainly we execute more people, and most countries, if I'm not mistaken, they don't have it. So, and I think there is this interesting question that goes along with it, and it's one I raised, I think, near the end of the panel, which is, when we think about prisons, are prisons only basically holding cells for people? We store people there, and let's not forget this dimension of it. We store them, and we make money for the people who own the prisons. Because it's interesting to learn that prisons, make some people a lot of money.
Yeah.
And of course, you have a lot of free labor or inexpensive labor as well. And you're just storing people for these purposes. And some would argue, and you're storing particular groups of people to kind of systemically disadvantage them. But that's a longer conversation. But where's the place of, I would say, systemic attempts at rehabilitation throughout the prison system?
Yeah.
Not. I mean, there are some places where that happens, but there doesn't seem to be an association of prisoner with any sense of rehabilitation. We're just going to put you away for a while, and you're going to kind of be stored, and that's it.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about, and again, this was in the panel, this idea of the hermeneutic. So back to a Christian looking at this and trying to either advocate for it or be against it in terms of the Bible.
Sure.
Because the Old Testament clearly speaks about it.
Yes, it does. It does. And the way David Gushee put it was, it's almost like if we just go with the New Testament. In the Old Testament, obviously, Genesis 9, if a person sheds blood, you shed a person's blood by man, will this person's blood be shed? So for some people, that's the only argument they need for the death penalty. In the Gospels, certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, there's the language about turning the other cheek, about being an agent of peace. And David juxtaposed basically being sort of a Sermon on the Mount person versus being a Romans 13 person. In Romans 13, you talk about the government having the use of the sword. And you could even say, actually, for some people, how do you deal with the end of Romans 12, which talks about being a generous person, loving your enemies? And then you have Romans 13, which talks about the government being the one that bears the sword and is the agent, the executor of justice. So do Christians let Romans 12 govern their behavior in the context of Romans 13? Or does Romans 12 lead to the disposition you have in your interpersonal relationships? But those interpersonal relationships are in contrast to what roles one would have if one is in a position of governance or being an agent of the government. And you basically wind up having people going back and forth about that. I mean, David Gushee, his position is the more non-death penalty and non-violence position. And there are a lot of other people who have the opposite view, and they keep talking back and forth.
And one of the interesting things I think came up in that panel was, if you're going to go with an Old Testament ethic,
yes,
for putting people to death, the Old Testament also says you'll only do this if you have 2 eyewitnesses, right?
Yes, right.
And we don't hold our courts to that standard, do we?
No, we don't. And actually, Kirk Bloodworth, who was on the panel, the reason that he was on death row was because of one eyewitness, really. And eyewitness testimony, depending upon who you're dealing with, but eyewitness testimony isn't always trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the question of, how is eyewitness testimony obtained? What's the context of obtaining it? What kind of questions are asked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all those things, goes back to the administration of justice question. I mean, is this being done because you want a conviction, or is this being done because you want justice?
Yeah. What kind of response did you get from the panel?
Well, I think most people, no one was against having eyewitnesses. I think the thing is how are you going to have a vigilance about the pursuit of justice? Now, it turned out that most of the panel specifically said that they were in opposition to the death penalty or wanted to try to have it overturned in all states, the United States, and I didn't mind people having that position. I mean, to me, the bigger thing was less people advocating for being against the death penalty or critiquing the eyewitness testimony question than it was, what we said earlier about raising the question for Christians, irrespective of their position, to have what I would call a thoroughgoing commitment to justice. And if you have that thoroughgoing commitment to justice, then whether you're talking about eyewitness testimony, whether you're talking about what's permissible evidence, what's not permissible evidence, whether you're talking about really trying to have a system where people who are accused of capital crimes, where they don't just have a public defender with an avalanche of a caseload trying to manage this amid many other things in the avalanche, that they really do have proper representation. Right. And even, there's the question of, has vigilance been done or due diligence been done so that a person, so that we're aware of this person's mental capacity, et cetera, because this isn't always the case.
Fascinating discussion, and I want to direct you, if this has kind of piqued your interest, you can go to WETN.org and look up the CACE videos, and you'll find this one. You can watch the whole thing and find a lot more detail there of what went on in that panel. Vince, it's always great to have you.
It was great to be here, and it was a great panel, and it lasted over 90 minutes, and most of the people stayed. There wasn't the usual exodus you get after the first hour.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yes, indeed.
Dr. Vincent Baycoat is Associate Professor of Theology at Wheaton and directs CACE, the Center for Applied Christian Ethics. Once again, go to WETN.org, and you can watch that video there. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.